Xue Chu, strong feelings. No man is wasted in our brilliant age. For the grand edifice, no timber cast aside. But the master craftsmen pay me no heed. Use I have, but won't chase a lover on my own. With plans in my breast, I gaze on my Lord's gates, and tarry there in vain till the year's end. The city of Qin is filled with horses and coaches. At day's evening, swirls of dust fly. Then, with rolling drums, the palace gates open. Horse bangles ringing pass paired watchtowers. And I hear how his thunder and rain are bestowed. None but are covered by heaven's enriching grace. So what we have today here with us is half a poem, 12 lines out of 24, by the Hai Tang poet Xue Chu. Now, Xue Chu is not one of the famous Hai Tang poets. I wasn't aware of his existence and learned of it while reading Stephen Owens's The Hai Tang. There he talks about him in a chapter dedicated to minor poets of the Kaiyuan and Tianbao eras, so the middle years, if you wish, of the 8th century, and that's a time that produces some of the greatest poets in Chinese history, Tang or no Tang, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, and so on. But Xue Chu, so he interacted with these people. We have only 12 extant poems of his that survive in an anthology, the Hou Yue Yingling Ji. And, for example, he's remembered as one of the poets that climbed the pagoda of the Temple of Compassionate Mercy with Du Fu, Zhen Shen, Gao Shi, and Chu Guangxi. Unfortunately, the poem he composed for that occasion has been lost. And, he was a well-known poet, especially in the Tianbao in the following decade. And, he connected and had friendships with people of different generations, from Wang Wei to Du Fu to Gao Shi to Liu Changqing, which represents the transition to the Dali era poets in the 750s, late 750s, 760s. As we say, unfortunately, not a lot of his poems have been preserved. Du Fu had a very high opinion of his poetry. And the poem that we read today is the only translation I think there is, even if it's a partial one, of Xue Chu to English. So what shall we say about this poem? So first thing, from the title, Strong Feelings, I think this is a ballad title, probably Yue Fu. But this poem belongs, or is generally classified, Owen at least classifies it, as a gufeng. Now, what were the gufeng? So, gufeng, which literally means old airs, were a type of poetry that was practiced from the period of disunion until many centuries later. What distinguished it from traditional, conventional Shi poetry is that it stuck with the very old Han Dynasty literary criticism view that poetry was mostly something that had to express moral, political criticism. Now, if you read the commentaries to the classic of poetry that were written down at the time that classic was fixated as one of the Confucian classics during the Han Dynasty, this type of literary theory, if you wish, basically makes the point that poetry expresses what's in the heart intently. But this is not like a romantic poetics in which poetry is seen, like in the Romantic period, as the expression of a great soul, of a unique individual. Rather, what's inside the person uniquely and with intention is political criticism. Whether the person composing the poem is a peasant or a Confucian scholar official, poems are a sort of indirect, politically permitted criticism or praise of the ruler. So, like, there's this myth that during the Zhou times and in other dynasties, the kings would collect popular ditties, popular songs, and these songs acted as a gauge of how well the country was being ruled. Like if the people composed sad songs or songs of protest, that meant there was a lot of corruption and misdoing. On the contrary, if they composed poems of praise to the ruler and poems of happiness, they were pointing towards good rulership. So this was a very old view of poetry. Already in the Tang, it was a very old-fashioned view of poetry that had fallen out of favor during the period of disunion, so from the fall of the Han in the early 3rd century to the reunification of China under the Xue and the Tang, which basically the late 6th, early 7th century. During all these centuries, poetry had developed. It had become a courtly, aristocratic art, which was, mostly a social lubricant of social interactions between the aristocrats and used for composing praises of beautiful women and objects and of, praising the emperor himself and his court. So poetry had developed in what stuffy Confucians would describe as a decadent, immoral type of art. Now, during these centuries, from time to time, there were some authors that wrote poems that still tried to do this kind of social criticism. An example in the middle of the 3rd century is Ruanji's collection of miscellaneous poems. And, this collection basically gave a start to a subgenre, which was this, we could call it, well, it's called gufeng, these old S type of poetry, which were poems that were generally pretty formally simple, direct, didactic, with political criticism, generally implicit, although sometimes close to explicit. And, they were like an anti-poetry tradition in poetry of criticizing bad social mores and bad rulership. It didn't become a very popular genre. Other more flamboyant and formally rich genres developed. One of its characteristics is, they are old as, so basically they continue old, late Han metrical forms, whether it is the Xue Chu or the Gushi, the old style poems, which generally means the number of lines can vary, but it's generally a collection of an indeterminate number of couplets, generally with metrical regularity, so heptasyllabic or pentasyllabic, although sometimes there's a mix. That's not very usual. That's especially when you're imitating songs of the Xue Chu, which had a very peculiar metrical style. They were songs of the Han, also used for political criticism, but we won't dwell on those for the moment. Anyway, so this genre of political criticism, gufeng, it's cultivated in the early Tang. There is an early Tang figure, Chen Zuang, who we've included in some of these videos. But yeah, Xue Chu is following this style in this poem, as we will comment in a minute. And before moving on to details of the poem, this genre actually developed, flourished, and became rather popular in the Middle Tang period, when it became, the basis for the return to antiquity, the fugu intellectual current that was presided by Han Yu, but also cultivated by others like Bai Yuji and Yuan Chen in their Xin Jue Fu, in their new ballads. And you could say, even if they aren't that moralistic, some of the High Tang poets, particularly Du Fu, also touched on social issues. So anyway, back to strong feelings. What's the topic of this poem, or at least of the half that we've read today? It's a scholar official's implicit complaint at not being employed. So this is a very common recurrent theme of the gufeng subgenre. In fact, the gufeng the personas of the gufeng poems are usually, or build themselves as, a counter-poetics and a counter-politics. And from their point of view, they always adopt this persona, which is usually, matches well with the real. But it's also a mask of the worthy scholar official that is not being employed by those in power, because, in serving the emperor, you have just flatterers and degenerates. And like the good, virtuous Confucian scholar officials are not paid attention to in decadent times. Of course, this is an indictment of politics and government, and You might imagine that rulers would not be too enthusiastic about this. There's generally a tradition of subduing the criticism or making it very indirect. And we see that in this poem. Like on the face of it, this poem is just saying, we're living in this wonderful age. The imperial capital is glorious and splendorous. Lots of people are serving there. I am not employed. I'm not worthy enough to be employed. Of course, the subtext is probably that the poet does consider himself worthy enough to be employed. But it would be impolite to just state it directly. And it could be read as criticism of the sovereign for not having the prescience and the good judgment of employing good people in office. So the poem has this idea, the laments, indirect laments, and the frustration of this poetic persona who is not being employed at this time of peace and splendor, which really is a time of peace and splendor at Haitang, one of the high marks of medieval China. Along with it, we get a description of the imperial court, or not a very detailed description, but you get a glimpse at Chang'an, at the palace doors, and at what might have been happening around there. Okay, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet, as we usually do. First couplet, no man is wasted in our brilliant age. For the grand edifice, no timber cast aside. So the poem starts pretty strongly. Everybody who is worthy is employed in this time. And the metaphor is, the time, the present time is like a big building, a massive wooden structure, like the real palaces and gates that were built in Chang'an. And all the wood that is worthy is used for the construction of the edifice. Brilliant Age is an interesting name. One of the nicknames for Emperor Tang Xuanzong, who ruled in this period, was Ming Huang, the brilliant emperor. So the age is brilliant, the emperor is brilliant. Yeah, so the flattery is pretty clear from the start. Second couplet. But the master craftsmen pay me no heed. Use I have, but won't chase a lover on my own. So the second couplet expands the topic. So we had apparently all the worthy men are employed in this era, but I am not, and I am worthy. And the metaphor of timber and building is used. The master craftsmen, presumably the advisors of the emperor, the ministers of state, don't pay attention to this man, and he won't chase a lover on my own. Well, this image refers to matchmaking. Like in traditional China, it was usual to employ a matchmaker to find a couple. But also, we mentioned the Xue very briefly when we were talking about the tradition of gufeng. The Xue established a convention. In the Xue poems, you have generally this man who is pursuing goddesses or female spirits. And the convention was here established of the minister and his ruler as in a relationship similar to that of the lover with the beloved. Okay, next couplet. With plans in my breast, I gaze on my lord's gates and tarry there in vain till the year's end. So the scholar official, the poetic persona here of Xue Chu, is not called to office, but he longs to serve. So he stays like a dog at the doors of the imperial city, of the imperial palace, hoping to be brought in. He has plans, he has ideas of what should be done, but he waits, the year passes, and he does not get called. Next couplet. The city of Qin is filled with horses and coaches. A day's evening, swirls of dust fly. So this is a very brief description of Chang'an. Chang'an is the city of Qin. Qin, the old warring states kingdom that had unified all the others, was in the area called now Guangdong, I think, the land within the passes, in today's northwestern China. Yeah, approximately. So the city of Qin is the main city in that territory, which was pretty close actually to the city that had been the capital of the Qin dynasty and of the Han dynasty before that. So the city of Qin is filled. This is a typical image. Any poems that make descriptions of Chang'an always put the emphasis on how bustling and busy it is. And it was a big city with more than 1 million inhabitants in the year 700 of the Common Age. So it was the biggest city in the world, arguably, at the time, along with Baghdad, probably. So we've got the city, it's all busy, horses and carriages go down through its wide avenues, dust swirls because so many people are treading and coming all through the day from morning till evening. Next couplet. Then with rolling drums the palace gates open, horse bangles ringing, pass paired watchtowers. So I'm not sure if we're still at evening, but the periods in which you could enter the imperial city were regulated for the civil service officials, and like those periods when the doors were opened, were accompanied by drum beating, massive drums beating, also announcing the curfews at night and the breaking of the curfews in the morning. So now we have these rolling drums, the palace gates open. If it was still at evening, this is the time for the people who serve at court to go back to their homes. Remember, the poetic persona has been waiting all day by the doors. And horse bangles ringing past paired watchtowers. So watchtowers, very typical constructions associated with the imperial palaces. They're called Xue. And they're, just big paired towers, which on a very horizontal, otherwise very horizontal city like Chang'an would have, stood out. And, big imperial gates and doors would have been escorted on left and right by these big watchtowers. And, the horses with the chariots with the scholar officials would be coming out. And the bangles would be ringing. Last couplet. And I hear how his thunder and rain are bestowed. None but are covered by heaven's enriching grace. This connects us with the beginning. So like the bounteous generosity of the emperor, which is equated to like a god. His thunder and rain are bestowed, his generosity on scholar officials who serve him. And none but are covered by heaven's enriching gate. Remember, the emperor in China is the son of heaven, Tianzi. He is a mediator between heaven and earth. And he adopts many of the attributes of heaven with respect to his people, who are seen as the earth. So, interesting half poem. As we said, this is not the ending of the poem. I don't know how it continued, but it probably would have continued, maybe with more descriptions of the sadness or the suffering of the scholar official, of the poetic persona who can't serve. But overall, it's a good example of this sort of emotionally high, but formally and stylistically subdued type of poetry that was popular in the subgenre of gufeng.